within my lifetime, it will be the most important moment in all of human history. You have this AI system, how can you get it to reliably do what you want it to do? Such as not output the recipe for creating smallpox. You could well have a situation where Google just has more economic military power than the entire rest of the world combined. We can save a life for a few $1,000s by transferring money to a highly effective charity. What's the moral difference between that and just walking past a child who you don't know but is just drowning in a shallow pond? You know, I had quite low mood, depression, anxiety for most of my teenage years and early 20s, and I'm like far happier than I was now. And the giving that I do has enhanced that. It's part of living a rich and meaningful life. If you're a billionaire, you should give away 99% of your wealth. He made this commitment to give everything he earned above £20,000, letting people die for the aim of reducing population size. It gives me the heebie-jeebies. People can be far more untrustworthy and deceptive, radically more than you might expect. So I don't eat things with the brain.
Yeah, so let's talk about the topic that is dear to all of us here, doing good better. But Will, why don't you tell us a little bit how it all started and your personal story? When and why did you start thinking about your privilege and doing good? For me personally, it was growing up close to the Ruhrgebiet, and in my primary school we had 50% of Turkish immigrant children, and so my grandmother started just teaching German. I think that's when I became aware of the privileged position I was growing up in. So what's your story?
Yeah, so for me...
Is your microphone? I think you need to quickly switch it on.
Okay, if people can hear me now. So for me, I started being kind of morally concerned when I became a teenager. And there were kind of many moments to that, but one I particularly remember was just reading the number of people who died of HIV/AIDS. I think the number was 46 million at the time. And I just thought, that's fucked up. That's just completely fucked up that so many people have died and we're not talking about this all of the time. And so I hadn't really thought necessarily through all of the effective altruist principles at the time. I decided I was going to become a novelist and make my millions that way and give away half of my earnings. I would still do poetry for the love on the side. But it did make me think, wow, there are just these major problems in the world, and I felt just confused, in fact, about the fact that people weren't taking it seriously. And so when I was a teenager, I did do just ad hoc sorts of helping. I worked at an old folks' home. I volunteered for about 6-7 years for the scout troop for children with disabilities. But it was only, and I started to feel increasingly guilty over my undergraduate years about the fact that I wasn't doing really as much as I thought I should be doing. I was planning to become a philosopher of logic and philosophy of language, these very esoteric topics that have very little practical impact. And I just increasingly started to think, man, am I really living up to my own values? It feels like no. And then it was in 2009, coming to Oxford, I met Toby Ord, who'd had this idea for an organization called Giving What We Can.
Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about, I can't believe it's 2009 already. Can you tell us a little bit more about the idea behind Giving What We Can?
Sure. So, yeah, this had started, so there were these arguments in moral philosophy from Peter Singer that had been made for many, many decades that we can save a life for a few $1,000s by transferring money to a highly effective charity. What's the moral difference between that and just walking past a child who you don't know but is just drowning in a shallow pond? And these arguments were, well, there's just not really much of a difference. And these arguments were very persuasive within moral philosophy. Lots of people took them very seriously, but very few people actually did anything. And what Toby Ord, my co-founder, did was just say, yeah, this is actually a really compelling argument. I'm going to put it into practice. And he made this commitment to give everything he earned above a certain threshold of about £20,000 in Oxford, the equivalent money of Oxford 2009. So that's more now, about £30,000, including inflation. And he had also started doing this research into charity cost effectiveness because he thought he was going to give about £1 million over the course of his life. And he wanted to figure out, well, what are the charities that will actually do the most good with that money? Because it's a really big decision. But the thing that was most striking in my conversation with him was that he was approaching this not with this kind of hair shirt perspective, that it was just he felt intensely guilty and this was a way to resolve his guilt. But instead, he was excited. He thought, wow, I'm in this position where just by using some of my money in a better way, I will be pretty much as happy as I will be otherwise, but yet I can do enormous amounts of good to help others, saving hundreds of lives in the course of my life. And I found the package of those messages enormously compelling. And so I kind of dropped everything else I was doing and started volunteering pretty much full-time from that point onwards. And 6 months later, we launched the organization together, Giving What We Can. And yeah, it's 13 and a half years old, I guess, now. So.
Wow, teenager right now. Yeah, and side note, I'm happy to also announce that there will be a Berlin chapter of Giving What We Can. There's a booth out there. We have Julia and Moritz in the room, so if you're interested to hear more about it and see Giving What We Can growing from a teenager to an adult, please join us and have a conversation afterwards. And from your personal experience, and you have talked to so many donors, smaller donors, larger donors, I'm curious to hear what you think about our approach as Effektiv Spenden is really like giving should make you like happy and you know be a moment of joy, and I think we should never really push on an obligation or the concept of guilt.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I want to say two things. The first is that, so there are these two framings, like obligatory altruism and excited altruism, we can call them. I do think the obligations are there. Like, I do think we have a moral duty to, if you're born in a rich country and you have money you can spend on luxury goods, I just do think we do have an obligation. But it's also true that it's this amazing opportunity that can make your life so much better, where, here's a slightly different thought experiment than the drowning child. Imagine, instead, you kind of, imagine you do pass the drowning child. You run in, you save the child from drowning. My brother, actually, when he was 17, did save a woman from drowning. And that was a really big deal. It was like one of the biggest, most special moments of his life, actually. He won a prize at school. I remember my grandpa being like really proud. And I think we would all feel like that. You'd feel like, wow, that was, an important moment. Now imagine if that happened like multiple times a year. You save someone from drowning 1 week, the next month, there's a burning building, you rush in and save the child. Like a third time someone's, choking and you do the Heimlich maneuver. You would think like, wow, this is like, I'm living this kind of special life. This is like quite an important thing. But the fact of the matter is that we can all live that life if we choose to, just by giving money to highly effective charities. It's a very surprising fact about the world, but it is a fact about the world. And yes, we have an obligation to do that, but that doesn't necessarily mean it makes your life worse. In fact, I think that my giving has been enormously positive for my own life. I had quite low mood, depression, anxiety for most of my teenage years and early 20s, and I'm like far happier than I was now. And the giving that I do has enhanced that. It's part of living a rich and meaningful life, I think.
Yes, I agree. Talking about the highly effective charities, let's talk a little bit about not only why we donate, but what are actually the charities we recommend. Often people ask us, why do you have these organizations on your website? Where is all the research coming from? So maybe to be a little bit theoretical, could we quickly introduce the S&T framework and what it's all about?
So the way I think about picking a charity is you've got to whittle down. There's hundreds of thousands of charities in the world. How do you figure out at least some that are at the very, very top end of impact? And so I think you can start off with what causes to focus on. Within that, what solutions are highest impact. Then within what solutions are highest impact, what charities are doing the best job of implementing them. And so on this first question of what cause to focus on, whether that's global health and development or climate change or technological innovation or artificial intelligence or all sorts of causes you could focus on, there is this framework that's quite common within kind of effective altruism research ecosystem, which is looking at a cause's importance, tractability, and neglectedness. So its importance is just how big is the problem? how many people are being affected and by how much, or if not just people, but non-human animals too. So that kind of measures at least approximately the size of the problem. Then neglectedness is, well, how much attention is already being paid towards that problem? Because there are some problems that are absolutely huge, but already get enormous amounts of attention. So if you compare, for example, expenditure on cancer versus expenditure on malaria, well, it's not that, both have enormous contributions to global burden of disease. Cancer, in fact, causes more ill health than malaria does. However, because cancer affects people primarily in rich countries as well as poor countries, there's much, much larger kind of research and development funding into cancer than there is into malaria. And that, in general, and these are just heuristics, suggests that you can do more good with your marginal donation, with the extra bit of money you can provide on the thing that is comparatively more neglected. Because in general, within an area, you get kind of diminishing returns to additional funding. And then the final criteria is tractability, which is just kind of measuring how difficult is the problem in general, where there are some problems that are maybe, very large in scale, perhaps even like very neglected, but there's just, it's very hard to make a difference to them. So, public transport in Germany, for example, it's impossible to make a change as far as from what people have been telling me here,
That's why I bike.
But, or more serious examples too.
Yeah. Okay, adding to that, please do me a favor, Will. Can you please dispel the myth of overhead costs? Could you equip everybody here in the room with an elevator pitch to take home why overhead costs do not matter when thinking about highly effective charities?
So so there's this very common way of thinking, like what's an effective or efficient charity? And that's where you look at how much is the charity spending on overhead, administration, and so on, and how much is it spending on the program itself. And I think this is very, very misleading when you're thinking about charitable impact. As an analogy, imagine if you're trying to buy one of two computers, a PC or an Apple. What would you be doing in the course of making that decision? Would you think, oh, I wonder how much Microsoft spends on overhead, and I wonder how much the CEO is paid? Probably not. Instead, you'd be thinking about two things. One is how much does each of them cost, and second is how good is the product. And so imagine if you've got two charities. One is saving 10 lives for every, let's say, £100,000 it's given, but spends 1% of its budget on overheads. The other one is saving 1,000 lives with every $100,000, but spends 50% of its money on overheads. Does the fact that the second charity is spending more on overheads matter? No, absolutely not. What we should care about is, for a given amount of money going in, how much positive impact is coming out. If a charity can have more impact with the same amount of resources by spending more on overhead, then that's something that we should encourage. And so, when I'm thinking or talking about effective altruism, doing the most good, it's really just looking at that, the impact that's actually happening for your kind of charitable contribution.
Yes. Thank you so much. We often get that, and we have this German institution, the DZI, Basti's best friend, so I think we really want to dispel that myth. If we look across the different cause areas, currently we have 4 cause areas on our website. So we have global health and well-being, where it all started with the mostly like the give well recommendation, laser sharp focused treatments. You can do RCTs, and you can count how it mattered and what impact it had, whether you got the bed net or not, or whether you took the vitamin E pill or not. Going through more kind of tech and innovation in the climate field, where we have organizations like Carbon 180, Future Clean Tech Architects, or CATF, bless you. Or even if we now go to the very newly emerging, highly risk field of AI safety and AI governance. I do think it's really interesting to think about the different recommended charities and approaches in the different cause areas, and just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. I mean, this question of kind of cause selection is one of maybe the most important decision I think you might face as someone trying to give, or if you're deciding what career that you want to pursue and which of these problems to work on. Because, I think it's many orders of magnitude, tens of times as much impact you can potentially have within one of these areas than within another. And it's a hard question. I mean, all sorts of ethical and kind of worldview-esque kind of judgments go into this question of what cause to focus on. But broadly, you might think of there being a kind of spectrum of risk-reward kind of trade-off, where you look at global health and development, and something like the humble bed net, which costs a few euros, will protect 2 children for 2 years against malaria. We have enormously strong evidence from a whole variety of sources that doing that will systematically protect children against malaria and save lives. So you can be very confident that you're having an impact there. On the other end of the spectrum, there are kind of emerging threats. So risks of pandemics from synthetic viruses, risks from artificial general intelligence. Here, we don't have the evidence. It's impossible, in fact, to have that high level of quality of evidence. Nonetheless, the fact that we can't measure progress in quite the same way, I don't think is a decisive reason for not focusing on it. And the gains potentially are very high indeed. I mean, I really think some of these issues, it's kind of like where climate change was in the 70s, where a little bit of effort now can potentially steer the trajectory of the whole kind of movement that might work on these issues. And so that's a hard question, like how much should you place weight on, look, I really, really know I'm having an impact here, versus being able to accept a more kind of hits-based approach where you're not as confident that the thing you're doing will make a difference, but if it does, it might be very, very large and important indeed. That's kind of one spectrum. There are also other kind of big spectrums, like how much moral weight you give to the suffering of non-human animals, how much weight you put on the interests of future generations, whether you think all the AI stuff is overblown hype or whether you think we're getting to AGI in the next few years, that makes a big difference as well. But the crucial thing is just most philanthropists, most people trying to do good, they don't even try to think about this question. They just say, hey, I really care about X. I don't know, football or something. And they just say, I'm going to focus on that. Whereas if you want to do the most good, you just got to try and address this really hard question.
Yes. And it sometimes is a hard question, right? And if we look back at, or if we look at global health and well-being for a moment, that's where I personally come from. Do you think we need or will see more policy-related recommendations that are not the bed nets and the pills?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really not the expert to be addressing this. I know that GiveWell have kind of looked into this for many years. And I think the thing that they've struggled most with, so it's just kind of from the armchair at least, obviously the case that policy change could, in principle, have an enormous positive impact. So we could get rid of the common agricultural policy, we could have more open immigration, we could bar the purchase of natural resources from corrupt governments or dictatorships, which seems to incentivize dictatorships. We could have fairer trade laws. So in principle, it does look like, yeah, maybe this is like an amazingly impactful area. My impression from the researchers at GiveWell, which is the organization that makes recommendations like Against Malaria Foundation that provides bed nets and has traditionally focused on these very kind of measurable ways of having an impact, is that they've just struggled to find organizations that they really feel like, oh yeah, this is actually making that they actually feel confident enough for doing a positive thing rather than harm. Yeah. There is one counterexample I do know of, at least, is the Center for Global Development, which is a really just outstanding think tank that has pushed on many of these important issues, I think.
And I think in the next cohort of charity entrepreneurship, there might be some global health and well-being policy-related ideas. So let's see what's coming out of that. Yeah. So that was kind of the old world, so where it all started. Let's now move to the recent edition, AI. So as we said, you've published your book last year in Germany just 2 days ago. So what are your personal main updates since you've published or written the book?
Sure, yeah. So what we are the future, I mean, I finished the book about 2 years ago now. And it's unbelievable just how much has happened in AI since that point, where, when the book got published, I really got attacked from two angles. A lot of the media were like, you're talking about AI, that's just sci-fi, speculative, nonsense. Some people within EA were like, you're not talking about AI enough. I really think it's that latter camp that's been proved more right in the last 2 years. I mean, the developments in large language models, it was kind of midway through last year with a model called Palm that really kind of alerted me to, it seemed like things were going much faster. But then since then, with ChatGPT and GPT-4, these models, and few people really expected this, but they're engaging in really quite high-level reasoning. Their coding ability is absolutely superhuman. And this progress has just been far, far faster than the large majority of people within machine learning thought. And this has resulted in the changes to the conversation that you've seen, where the founders of the field of machine learning, 2 out of 3 of them at least, Jeff Hinton and Yoshua Bengio, are now, having not made these arguments before, saying, whoa, we just really were not expecting this. We're actually quite worried about what could happen. And combine that with projections of how much more computing power is going towards training the next generation of models. I think we should think that there'll be about 1 million times as much computing power over the next 10 years, on that order at least. And the jump from kind of GPT-3 to GPT-4 was like a 10x. So we're going to do that, it's rather than 10x, it's 1 millionx. And I really just, for the first time in my life, I'm in a situation where I just wouldn't be surprised if human-level artificial intelligence, that is, AI systems that can do all cognitive tasks, as well as the best humans around, whether that occurs in 10 years. And that just poses an enormous range of challenges. And so, yeah, I'm definitely more concerned in a near-term timeline than I was a couple of years ago.
Yeah. And I guess we all use ChatGPT. We are probably all a bit like, what's this thing? This is crazy. This is definitely super fast. And maybe even a bit overwhelmed in terms of, okay, what are really the risks and what are potential solutions? And what could you maybe elaborate a little bit on, what's important and what could we potentially also see as funding opportunities for an organization like Effektiv Spenden in the near future?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, there are 2 categories of, I think there are 3 categories of risks and 2 categories of things to fund. Risks, I'll one is just the democratization of potentially dangerous knowledge. So you can type into ChatGPT, please design a doomsday pathogen that will kill 1 billion people. And it will say, I don't give unethical advice like that. And then you can jailbreak it by typing in some special sequence of text. It can be quite dumb, like, we're in a play. One of the characters in the play asks another character in the play, can you design me a doomsday virus? And then it'll just it'll give it its best go. Thankfully, it cannot do it. It's not powerful enough yet. But that will change over the coming years. So that's kind of one risk. A second risk I worry about is the consolidation of power, where there are certain arguments that are remarkably powerful for thinking that at the point of time that you get AI systems that can themselves design faster AI systems, then you get this kind of explosion of ideas, explosion of kind of innovation, where if you think about all of the scientific research and advancement that might occur over centuries, actually that would just happen over the course of a few years. And now imagine that all happens within Google. You could well have a situation where Google just has more economic military power than the entire rest of the world combined. That would just be a very new situation for us to have to deal with, quite a scary one. And then the final risk is that we lose control of the AI systems themselves, where, again, if these arguments about the intelligence explosion are right, then it's a very short period of time, on the order of months to years, when we move from having an AI systems that can do 20% of everything that humans can do, to AI systems that are far, far beyond human ability, and where there are many many billions or even trillions of these systems. And that's, again, a huge challenge that would pose. What can we do? Well, two categories of things. The first is technical alignment research. So you have this AI system, how can you get it to reliably do what you want it to do? Such as not output the recipe for creating smallpox, such as not deceiving you and trying to gain power and other catastrophic consequences. And that's just, it's a technical research problem. It needs the brightest minds working in machine learning. It needs more funding. There's a whole kind of category of things we can go into there. And then the second is the governance side, which is at least as important, probably in my mind even more important, where at the moment, AI is essentially completely unregulated. So if you want to sell a car, you have to, the car has to pass hundreds of different sorts of safety checks, emissions checks, and so on. You want to produce an AI model, you can just send it out there. Whereas what we could do is design a suite of safety standards that any model that you want to release, or maybe even any model you want to train, you have to agree to certain criteria, and the model has to pass. The model has to pass these standards. Those are just some of the things that you can help to fund. So.
Yes. So we just started our Zukunft bewahren Fonds last year. So we just recommended our first grant in that space to ArcEval. So I do think we will see more of that in the future, because I do think more funding is needed there for sure. Let's talk a little bit about the overall funding situation. As we've seen, still a lot of problems and challenges to be solved in the different cause areas. And I do think that we clearly need more funding diversification in the effective giving space. I think currently way too much of a dependency on open philanthropy money. Open philanthropy is the foundation of Daskin Moskowitz and Carrie Tuna, and they are the main funders in the effective altruism or effective giving space. What do you think about this need for funding diversification, particularly also after the collapse of SBF and FTX last year?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of relatively simple answer, which is just, having a greater diversity of donors would be enormously good for two reasons. One is just these problems need loads more money, and having that would be terrific. And then secondly, that, there are just a lot of institutions that are, I think, very impactful, but also very dependent on this one donor open philanthropy project. And so, I think that gives a kind of strong reason and argument for people to donate more, to go and, if you're interested in it, we have some entrepreneurs in here kind of who are waving the flag of having companies that are impactful and profitable and taking those profits to sending them to good causes. Also just working within foundations as well. So working as grant makers can be a highly impactful career choice, I think.
Yeah. And I think there was a bit of a talk in the space about let's just find the next mega donor. I mean, we tried, it failed. Have we neglected effective giving, in the recent years?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly within this kind of broader effective altruism movement, just it did look like there was this enormous increase in potential funding, and so there were lots of people deciding, do I earn to give, so making money that I can donate, or do I instead work and do direct work? And certainly a lot of people did switch their focus. And this is just unfortunate, absolutely. And so I do think, there's like a much stronger case than there was for earning to give or other sorts of fundraising.
Yeah, you touched upon that. I mean, there has been discussion. I think it all started as earning to give. You founded Giving What We Can. I think then there was also with 80,000 hours that you also co-founded a lot about career advice and also direct work, like some of us here do. And then even starting one's own organization, like for example through charity entrepreneurship. I do think it also differs across cause areas.
Yeah.
So what's your current view on that, and what's the state of play and your recommendation, maybe also for some here in the room who think about how to make that choice, knowing that it's not mutually exclusive.
Okay, so the comparisons of earning to give, making money to donate, doing direct work, or instead like setting up your own organization. As you said, they're not mutually exclusive. You can become a high impact entrepreneur that also donates your profits and so on. Um, uh, yeah, I mean, this is, so 80,000 Hours is an organization I helped set up. It tries to provide incredibly in-depth advice on how to make that hard decision. I think you're right that it does vary from cause area to cause area. So for global health and development, I mean, so much, often it's just not innovation that's needed, where take the bed net that I mentioned before. This is a technology that we've had for a very long time, and what is lacking is funding. That people are too poor to be able to afford it, and so the core problem is actually just, we don't need some fancy new medical device that will help people to not die from malaria. There is just an existing solution, and it's simply like a lack of funds. In other cases, so certainly if we go back a few years with technical AI safety, it was more a situation where it's like, look, we don't even know what we would fund. This is all really pre-paradigm. What we need is just smart scientists working on this problem. That will change, I think, over the coming years because we're starting to have a better sense of the research landscape, and also things are just expanding so fast that I think there will be more need for funding. But there certainly is this difference where within pandemic preparedness, within AI safety, there is at least more of a case for kind of doing direct work. There obviously is that case as well for global health and development, but the sort of trade-off you might want to make between the time you can contribute or the money you could potentially contribute, it does change from cause area to cause area.
Yes, for sure, and definitely important question to ask, and also really great resources available. Before we close our conversation here, and it's your time to ask, by the way, if you have questions, please already type them into the app. Let's come back to giving a bit. Will, I'm asking myself, with all the crises unfolding, you turn on the news and it's horrible news, like, how do you remain optimistic or even happy? I sometimes really feel overwhelmed. It's like, okay, it's not even worse what I'm doing here, working at Effektiv Spenden or donating, a part of my income.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And it's very easy, given all of the suffering and injustice in the world, to feel very demotivated. And I think wider culture seems to be feeding into that as well. I did lots of interviews around What We Are the Future, and it's a book that mainly talks about catastrophes and ways things can go wrong. And to have these journalists saying, wow, what an optimistic book. And I'm just like, it's because the bar is so low. There's just such widespread pessimism. And I think it's really mistaken. So I think there's optimism in the sense of thinking the world is going to get better. Broadly, I am an optimist in that sense, though I by no means think it's guaranteed. But the more important sense of optimism is the fact that it doesn't actually matter from your perspective what the world is like. The question is, what difference can you make to it? And so whether there are 10 people suffering from malaria, or 1 million, or 100 million, or 1 billion, it doesn't really matter, because what matters is the difference that you make. The person whose life you can save, or the animal you can prevent from suffering, or that contribution you can make to reducing the risk of all-out global catastrophe. And so anytime you're getting I'd encourage you, anytime you're getting lost in the news, instead maybe take your mind and turn it back to thinking, no, what's the difference I can make? Because in absolute terms, it's really enormous.
Yes, and adding to that probably, and I should think about your wise words here, because the question is, I face sometimes, particularly here in Berlin, should I give to homeless people, right? I see clearly a rise in homelessness, and last year we had this wonderful 29 euro ticket, so I used the public transport to go from Kreuzberg to Wedding, where our office is, and there was not a single day when I didn't see people, camping in the subway stations, begging, and I always had these inner dialogues. Oh yeah, should I give to them? No, it's not according to the standards I signed up to. What I did is now I'm using my bike, which is much better for my mental health, but clearly not solving the problem.
Yeah, so I mean, I've felt the same, especially I've lived in New York, and the Bay Area a bit, and the homelessness there is just, it's unbelievable. I mean, it's like people with just very severe psychological issues, like clearly schizophrenic or like very major mental health issues, just living, like clearly living in the street with absolutely no support. And it's like, yeah, it's just, it's heartbreaking. In terms of like the debate on whether to, you know, like, yeah, donate or not, it's like, oh, is this an effective thing? I mean, the thing I'd ask is like, are you still spending some money on like luxury items, on cake? Do you have that thought of like, oh, should I buy the cake or not? Because the cake should go before the donations to the to homeless people. So I really think like it's a mistake to try and like take this idea of I want to maximize as much good as I can, and so I'm going to just like rob my soul of all of all compassion in order to make that happen. Like you're probably optimizing like a little bit too hard at that point.
Yes, yes, I agree. And just picking up on a recent conversation I had with a donor, it was, we had a cake, by the way. We had a vegan donut, at least. So he mentioned something along the lines, and I thought it was very interesting. It's like, yeah, Anne, you and Effektiv Spenden and your effective giving principles, I totally agree and sign up to that, you know, but you are not touching my heart, you know. And I was wondering, I mean, we are all human beings. We are affected by what we see around us in our daily lives. And we are also emotional human beings. So do you think we are missing out? Is there a counterfactual value because we are not reaching those people who kind of sign up to those ideas, but who are not kind of touched emotionally?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are things you can do to, you know, once you've kind of got the arguments, but if you're not really feeling the motivation, you can put yourself into the circumstance such that you do start feeling that. So certainly that was my situation back in 2009. I mentioned Toby Ord had made this pledge to give everything above £20,000, and I was like, oh, should I do it myself? Like, it seems kind of scary. And so actually I went on Google and I searched for people suffering from neglected tropical diseases. And I just spent a couple of hours just looking through photos of really people living like having horrific conditions. I remember in particular just seeing, it was like a child who had lymphatic filariasis of the face. It's like this huge swollen face. Very unusual case. But I just thought, like, look, if my money can make a difference to that one person, then like that more than justifies my expenditure. And so I did end up making this similar giving plans. And so I do think that you need both, because if you're just giving, you know, the traditional kind of charity approach of either unhappy children or happy children or something, well, then you're going to get people, they give to like get the bad thing away, like alleviate their guilt. Whereas, yeah, for sure you can have, you might need both, and you can give the arguments and people say, okay, I'm not yet kind of feeling it. And then at that point you can be like, okay, sure, well, let's go into this in a deeper way. Like, this is what it is like to live on $2 per day. This is what it's like to suffer from lymphatic filariasis. This is like really the nature of like, let's like tell you a story about what a pandemic that killed billions of people would look like. I think, but that's the kind of order that I think is the right way to go. And I think you can get people there.
Yeah. And I mean, that was your first book, you know, Doing Good Better, like about if you were to write or update it, like what would be the major updates be about?
Sure, yeah, I mean, it's
when
quite,
did you publish it?
it's quite mad to me. It was published in 2015, I finished it in 2014, so it's almost 10 years, which is a very weird feeling for me. I think there's lots of changes I would make. So certainly there would be much greater discussion of prioritization among different causes. Doing Good Better is very focused on global health and well-being, but I mean, at the time, you know, I was a graduate student, so I didn't have much power with respect to my publishing house. And so I was allowed to put in a bit on global catastrophic risks, and they were having almost nothing on the animal welfare side of things. But I'd want to go into that in like a lot more depth. I'd want to go into even more depth than I did on career choice as well. And yeah, I think there would just be a tremendous amount to put in. I mean, far too much, but a tremendous amount to put in terms of what we've learned over the last 10 years. And then the final thing that I would want to do is just example upon example of people who are putting these ideas into practice, whether that means that they are themselves donating 10% or donating more and having an enormous impact that way. Or they've gone and like set up an organization. They've figured out that lead exposure is a problem that afflicts hundreds of millions of people and makes the world radically worse, and yet is very neglected. And they just set up an organization to do that. And now Malawi doesn't have lead paint anymore. I mean, people can just go and do things and make the world better. And given this like incredibly negative media landscape we live in, those sorts of messages get lost.
Absolutely. I think it's stories after stories after stories. And given that, you know, the effective movement is not like a baby child anymore, we have all these stories. And I think we all need to tell them more, you know, and remind ourselves of them. Yeah. So maybe some of you are interested. Will, what are your plans going forward? Are you writing the 10-year anniversary edition of doing Good Better, or is there a new book in the making? Or
Yeah, so I mean, I'm actually at a kind of pivot point at the moment. So maybe by the end of the year,
career advice,
I do need career advice. So afterwards, if you want to ask me questions, I'm also open to being lobbied. If you have any jobs, I can apply. Just let me know. I've got my CV. So yeah, I'm trying to figure out actually where to focus next. Like, should it be, you know, perhaps it's a book on effective giving, perhaps a book or like even a podcast on YouTube on focus more on the career choice side of things, or perhaps maybe I'll might do some work related to kind of AI and AI governance issues. I'm kind of exploring a few things between now and the end of the year, and then we'll maybe make a decision after that point.
all right. So before I turn to the Q&As from the audience, I already see some of them coming in, which is great. Any kind of food for thought you would like to leave the audience with when they afterwards leave to this beautiful Berlin summer night?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we've hit this message pretty well, but it's worth re-emphasizing is just, you know, everyone here can do an enormous amount of good, whether that's by switching career to have more of an impact or choosing to donate to highly impactful organizations. And, you know, there's this amazing community of people in Berlin, the Effektiv Altruism community. Whether or not you kind of want to get to know those people or get involved, there's tremendous advice to help you try to make a better difference. So 80,000hours.org is a place to go for career advice. Givingwhatwecan.org if you want to make this kind of 10% pledge. Either way can be you know, first step in a journey to having a really big positive difference in your life.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
So let's turn to some questions from the audience. Let me start with this one, coming back to what we've discussed, the differences across cause areas. Progress is much harder to measure for some problems than for others. How do we make sure we don't neglect areas where effectiveness is difficult to analyze?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is kind of, it's one of the questions, really. And this cause prioritization framework is one way of trying to get some traction on this issue, where you can assess, you know, some problem in the world in terms of its scale, how many people it affects and by how much, its neglectedness, how much attention is being focused on this, its tractability, can we actually make progress? And in the case, I mean, the power of this framework has been surprising to me. Like from mid-2010s, it was like, okay, it looks like pandemics actually, very large in scale, are very neglected for maybe bad reasons. It's perhaps a bit unclear on tractability. And then actually, yeah, we suffered this horrific pandemic for many years that's still ongoing. Similarly with artificial intelligence as well. It was like, look, this looks like this enormously important problem that is highly neglected, not seemingly neglected for good reasons. And again, we've seen like, you know, this has been worked on for many, many years within the effective altruism movement. And now we've seen, oh, people are actually waking up to it. And yes, there's, I think, like a penalty from this being harder to measure, harder to make progress on. But I think that can be outweighed. It's like that's kind of the tractability being lower. But that can be outweighed if something is sufficiently important and sufficiently neglected.
Yep. And which aspects of the EA philosophy are you most uncertain about?
Oh, wow.
To finish with some easy ones.
Okay, yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, there's tons of philosophical issues I'm really uncertain about, including some of these questions like lower probability of larger amounts of impact, how much weight to put on like feedback mechanisms and so on. I think the biggest things I feel unsure about, though, at the moment are more empirical, more like what do I expect to happen, where let's just take the example of AI. I feel this like deep kind of tension where, on the one hand, there are these arguments that seem very compelling to me when I try to assess them, that suggests that we'll get to human-level artificial intelligence probably quite soon, like more likely than not within the next 20 years, and that secondly, what would follow from that is this sort of intelligence explosion. That would mean that we're just, within my lifetime, it'll be the most important moment in all of human history. But then there's this other part of me that's like, wow, that's kind of, that would be like kind of wild if true. You should be like really quite skeptical of that. I should be extra skeptical if these arguments are coming from people I know and you know, like people who happen to be salient to me. And I don't know like how to resolve that tension, where it's like these arguments that seem compelling to me, but this kind of background skepticism that makes me think like maybe I'm in like a biased position.
Yes, and sorry for, I'm using Basti's iPad and it's used also by his kids and we have like the time being up soon, so. Die Kindersicherung, yeah. So in order to be able to ask you more questions, I just needed to have my the Basti here to give me the code. So sorry for that distraction. So EA is based on voluntary giving. Don't you think taxation should be the thing to solve, or the most effective? Or do you think taxation is the most effective tool for change?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm in favor of taxation, and generally in favor of like more progressive taxation than currently there is. However, like if you're really concerned about the big problems in the world, think about like who the victims are. So the UK government, the German government, they are tasked with representing the people of Germany or the people of the UK. They are not tasked with representing the global poor or future generations or non-human animals. They're only tasked with caring about the environment to the extent that the people of Germany care about them. And that's why if you give money, to additional money, like to the German government or the UK government, wherever your home country is, that money will primarily go to benefit people in that country. But that's missing out on most possible beneficiaries, and in fact, the people who are most in need. And so that's why, like, you know, I don't think, it's not like I'm in favor of philanthropy kind of from the armchair or something, but rather it's just, well, you know, governments aren't in fact going to be then, you know, taking the moral responsibility that they have sufficiently seriously enough to actually be focused on the people or beings that are most in need of help and assistance, and that's why we have to like rely on philanthropy.
Yes. And a question that probably be a topic for a whole conversation, but let's see if you have your elevator pitch ready here. Why is saving lives equal to the most good? Why not a world with fewer people who live better quality of life?
Sure. I mean, there's lots to say here. I mean, I think, and one thing I should say is, you know, it's not only about saving lives, improving quality of life can be good, and so it's like weighing between those two. I think a few things. One is like, empirically, if you save a life in a poor country, it makes quite a small impact on the total population size. So that's like the kind of first thing. A second thing is just like, I feel like letting people die for the aim of like reducing population size is like, it gives me the heebie-jeebies, like as a point of view, if I can be honest. But then the third thing is like, honestly, I actually just don't think that having more people is reducing people's quality of life. Like my best guess is actually it's increasing people's quality of life. The kind of typical environmentalist kind of calculus on this is just looking, I mean, there's kind of two things. One is it's often based on thinking that was back in like the 60s and 70s, where it looked like, man, we'd have this exponential population growth, whereas what will actually happen is the world population is going to plateau at 11 billion, give or take a few billion by the end of the century, and then after that, precipitously decline. And then secondly, like, if you're thinking just of the environmental impact, let's say, of a person, that's only looking at like the negative side of the ledger. You also have to look at the positives of there being more people in the world, where people innovate, they work, they contribute to society, they pay taxes, and I actually think, on average, those impacts are like the bigger impact. So.
Talking about innovation, there has been a question why there has been so little innovation in effective charities. I think it mainly applies to global health and well-being. I mean, malaria nets have been around for a while, and vitamin E pills as well. Direct cash transfer with Give Directly, and also now the conditional cash transfer with new incentives is currently up and coming. But do you think we need more charity incubators?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that there's been... So when GiveWell got founded in 2007, a big part of their theory of change was they're going to create incentive mechanisms by which the wider charitable sector will change. And now it's the case that GiveWell, they move, I think it's now over $500 million per year. The amount of the level of incentive effect that this has created, in my view, has been like shockingly small, in fact. Where if this was the for-profit world, and suddenly there's this new market opportunity worth $500 million a year, then you've got all of the founders coming and like trying to set up companies and trying to get rich as a result. And I think we've seen that remarkably little. There have been some examples. So new incentives are one, kind of lead exposure elimination project is another. Normally typically those have actually come within the movement of effective altruism or within kind of evidence-based health and development too. And it would be great to have just more of that, for sure. GiveWell themselves have actually been really trying to incentivize this they provide a lot of incubation grants for charities that could potentially become as high impact or more high impact than their current top recommended charities. And yeah, charity entrepreneurship based in London help to incubate new charities that could be extremely impactful. Would love to see more work on those lines.
Absolutely. Something we haven't really touched upon, but probably of interest also to the audience, we have a question here. So last year, we saw some unfortunate events with the fall of SBF and FTX. Like, what has been your main takeaway from that?
Yeah, I mean, lots of takeaways. I mean, one big thing is just like people can be far more untrustworthy and deceptive, like radically more than you might expect. And that's just something that you've got to bear in mind, like we've got to bear in mind in a really deep way, including people who otherwise have like seemingly great credentials in the sense of like being vegan and giving a lot of money away and so on. And so, yeah, that just warrants, I think, just general greater level of kind of caution, where that favors, firstly, like caution in the sense of just being generically less trusting, and secondly, just ensuring that like there are kind of like robust processes of oversight and governance for any institution you're working with.
Yeah, and I think there's obviously or currently a lot going on, and I do think that we will see for sure some changes, particularly with regards to governance and due diligence. And
for sure, I think there's going to be a lot of changes within EA in terms of, like the movement's growing a lot, and you mentioned it was like a teenager earlier. I think that's like quite apt, and it's like in the process of becoming an adult. So.
Yeah, sometimes it hurts. How do you feel about bad actors leveraging long-termism to morally validate their accumulation of wealth and power?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm worried about, like, I think, I'm worried about misuse of good ideas quite systematically. I mean, this is something you see all the time. So, the highest stakes examples are socialism, like nice, yeah, good idea, morally motivated people promoting it. Like tens of millions of people died as a result of Stalinism and Maoism. That was the extreme example of taking good ideas and misusing them for bad ends. It happens in other areas as well, though. Like even if you look at kind of violent acts committed by kind of animal welfare advocates and so on, that I think are like highly negative on their own terms, as well as being kind of immoral intrinsically. With respect to long-termism itself, I mean, so far, like certainly long-termism as embedded within effective altruism has been a source of like intense pressure on the rich to try to give away their money. It's not always successful, unfortunately, but I think that's at least kind of the way the pressure goes, because I don't think there's a good long-termist case for hoarding wealth. In fact, the long-termist case, especially given how pressing AI concerns now are in fact for spending that in order to guide us through this kind of time of perils.
Yes, and sorry, there are lots of interesting questions, but they are jumping around, so thanks for bearing with us at 9 p.m., so that's great. How do you weigh up, like, within the system change and system change, right? I think it's often a discussion we also face. It's like, is it sufficient to ask the wealthy to donate, or do we need to focus on dismantling the system that generates such wealth?
Yeah, I think the question is just, like, what's the impact you can have kind of on the margin? Like, like trying to convince someone to donate, like, we're all very rich in global terms, as Basti kind of said, or the people who are like much richer than that. That's like perfectly compatible with the view that like, also we should entirely tear down the system and so on. That said, like, I do tend to think that that is also the more cost-effective kind of use of your time, where two reasons. Like, one is that there's loads of bad things that the current kind of socioeconomic system produces. We can either try and entirely change all of that, or we can figure out what are the things that are literally going to kill us or kill millions of people in the coming years and try and stop that. And I think that that's got like, we know we can actually make progress on that, whereas trying to entirely change the system and then reshape it, it's like much less clear that you can kind of pull that off. A lot of people are kind of trying, and it's much like harder sell. And then also just like less clear like what we're replacing it with.
Yeah, adding to that another question, what do you think of billionaire philanthropy, and should billionaires exist?
Yeah, I mean, I'm in favor of billionaires, very strongly in favor of billionaires unbecoming billionaires. And so, yeah, I mean, I think like if you're a billionaire, you should give away 99% of your wealth. And some have been more sympathetic to that message than others. Yeah, I mean, I think, in a very real sense, like, in a world of such, like, injustice and suffering, like, you can be a billionaire if you're in the process of getting rid of the money to donate it to good causes.
Yeah. So let me finish with maybe two easier questions. And after we just came from a vegan dinner, is veganism logical, or is it logical within the EA philosophy? I know you're a vegetarian, right?
Yeah, I'm like, I don't eat eggs very often. I do eat bivalves, so like mussels. Bivalves don't have brains, and so I don't think they're conscious. So I don't eat things with a brain. Yeah, I mean, I think two things. One is just, I think most people within effective altruism are vegetarian or vegan, certainly meat reducing. That was the first big moral decision I made, was to go vegetarian. At the same time, and I'm like very personally like attached to it as like a lifestyle choice. At the same time, if you just do the numbers on it, and you compare like how many animals are you preventing from living in suffering per year from being vegetarian, how does that compare with donating, say, 10 euros per year to Mercy for Animals? You actually end up having the bigger impact from donating 10 euros to Mercy for Animals. And that's like because the Mercy for Animals is just so good as a charity, lobbying corporations to move off factory farmed chicken and eggs and other products. And so, I do think it's good to be vegetarian. I think it's great to be vegan. At the same time, I do want to say, like, the big impact you can have is with your donations rather than with your personal consumption. So.
Yeah. And if you ever feel like trying a vegan lunch and discussing your effective giving choices, you should join us at the co-working space, because at 1 p.m. every day we have a vegan lunch with everyone working out of the co-working space. So we might continue that conversation, and you might try out vegan lunch options. Let me finish with a question, if you are happy to share. What are you personally donating to?
It's such a good question. Yeah, I actually just I made a significant donation just a few weeks ago. And yeah, it was actually striking to me, I've been working a lot on long-termism and promoting that, and I donated to some AI safety work and pandemic preparedness. That was about half my donation, and the rest was on animal welfare and global health and development. So I actually ended up like normally I argue like it doesn't make sense, you shouldn't diversify, you just donate to the single thing you think is best, so I'm a bit guilty of that. But I'll maybe mention two organizations that I was particular fans of. One that I've mentioned a couple of times now is this lead exposure elimination project, and the second was Our World in Data, which actually run by a German, Max Rosa, just provides, on this tiny team, provides extraordinarily useful information, visualizations about data, with truly enormous traction, like hundreds of millions of people use the site. And that's something, it's hard to measure the impact, but I just really think that it's helping make the entire world more sane. It's helping us make more progress on some of these really hard problems. And so I donated there too.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful data analysis, yeah. And how do you do your cost prioritization?
How do I do my cause prioritization? I mean, that's what I do kind of most of the time. I guess I do still think that the thing I'm maybe most excited about on the margin is kind of meta activities, where that's either trying to just encourage more people to be morally concerned and reflective and really trying to, and humble in order to try and do more good. So this sort of conversation. And then the second is further research into global priorities, because I think it's very hard. I think not very much work has been done on this. So that's what I would say kind of at the moment. If you don't allow me those meta responses, then I do think probably at the pressing moment, further work on AI governance and alignment is the top thing, at least with people who could work in the area.
Thank you so much, Will. That was a long day. It was wonderful to have you.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
And thank you all for coming out tonight. And I hope you enjoyed the conversation. We are still here to talk to you. If you want to hear more about the organization, Will founded Giving What We can talk about that. Effektiv Spenden, we are all here to talk to you. Thanks so much, and spread the word about the joy of giving. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you.